I'm Mackenzie Peterson.
And I'm Mona Shu, and this is a special Psych Sessions series on mentoring.
Our guest today is Dr. Dina Gohar, who is a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan. Dr. Gohar received her bachelor's degree from Harvard University, magna cum laude, with highest honors in psychology. She then taught and counseled disadvantaged youth in France and London, and enthusiastically recommends working and studying abroad if possible for all students. After a couple years in Europe, Dr. Gohar completed a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania's Positive Psychology Center and a doctorate in clinical and social psychology at Duke University. She completed her pre-doctoral internship in lifespan clinical psychology at the University of Michigan's Mary A. Rackham Institute and a postdoctoral fellowship in child clinical psychology at the University Center for the Child and the Family. Throughout her training and professional career, Dr. Gohar has been passionate about teaching and mentoring and is highly experienced in mentoring students on research, teaching, and clinical work. So, welcome to Psych Sessions and our series on mentoring, Dina.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Oh, well, we're so excited to have you. So, with all of your experience related to mentoring, we'll start off with just figuring out what mentoring is to you or what you think a mentor is.
Someone who provides guidance, perspective, wisdom, support in reaching whatever your goals might be. So it's beyond building knowledge and skills like you would do as a teacher. I think it's also even more personalized than you are in the role of a teacher, right? Because you're developing your mentees as people and getting to know them, I think, more than you get the chance to, since it is a one-on-one relationship. You just get more of a chance to do that than you do in the classroom. I think of it as more than just the transfer of knowledge, skills, and guidance. You're also really helping them figure out what their life goals are, helping achieve them. And it might not always be you. It's also like just connecting them to the right people as well, and knowing when that's the most helpful thing to do. That's not really like a research definition, but yeah.
Well, it's your definition, and that's important to hear too. But yeah, I really like the idea that it's a very holistic thing that we are doing when we're mentoring people. It's not just like you said, just that transference of knowledge and guidance. It's so much more than that. And it's this very complex, meaningful relationship.
Yeah.
Building on that definition, how would you describe your mentoring style?
That's a good question. I think it's evolving, but it's always been really collaborative. It's also just meeting mentees where they're at and adapting accordingly. So whether that's freshmen as part of the undergraduate research opportunity program, and so they have zero experience with anything at all, versus seniors that you're helping through honors theses, what your role is you're still a mentor, but like I'm much more hands-on with a freshman and giving them kind of step-by-step guidance on everything than I would be with a senior who's trying to, you're trying to actually cultivate their own skills as a researcher. So it's also learning how to foster that independence. So it's like it's just very different. But so I would say it's also very adaptive and adapting according to whatever the individual mentee's needs are. Pretty warm and relational. I think I've like, just because I've also done a lot of therapy. I'm also a clinician, so I know how important a good relationship is. We know that now in the classroom, right? That it's really important. It's definitely really important in a mentoring relationship. And so taking the time to really actually get to know your mentees and have them get to know you. So there's like a debate in therapy about self-disclosure and how much to do that. But I think in mentoring, I know there's like still research being done on this. I tend to use self-disclosure a lot, and I think that helps. Being your authentic self as much as possible then gives your mentees permission to be themselves. And the more you're able to be vulnerable, the more they're able to bring up if they do have difficulties, because the learning process. And especially if you're mentoring them in research, there's a lot of ups and downs in the research process. And I think they don't always necessarily realize how hard the research process is until they actually get through with it and do it. I experienced that also with students in my research methods classroom, because we do studies from the ground up and they're usually, kind of very humbled by the experience. I would say, yeah, like collaborative is the thread, modeling vulnerability, authenticity, a growth mindset for your students as well, both in the classroom and I think as a mentor as well.
That's so fantastic. So many things there that I want to follow up on, but I really appreciate the very student-centered way you're talking about this collaboration, right? Because we can think about collaboration a lot of different ways, but very early on, you were talking about meeting students where they are, and so adapting to students. Because I could also see mentorship where the mentor could expect the student to adapt to them, to their expectations, to lab norms, and instead you're going out of your way to form these relationships, see what students' needs are, and then be flexible around that, which I think is so great. And I appreciate you pointing out it is a debate in therapy and in teaching and in all sorts of relationships, like how much do we share of ourselves, how vulnerable and authentic to try to be. And certainly there are pros also to having more boundaries, right? So there's a time and place for different things, but I like that overall you're modeling things that sounds like you're really focused on students' well-being and not just, what they're going to be able to produce for you or what they're able to learn from you. But also recognizing that if you're modeling authenticity, they're able to be more authentic. That's actually going to make for a better learning environment as well.
You do get away with more in a mentoring relationship, I think, than you can in the classroom, depending on the size of the classroom, especially.
Right.
And yeah, as someone that's from a historically underrepresented group and a woman, right, we know that we take hits on student evals and things like that to begin with. And so I think you have to be a little bit more careful about what you self-disclose, and because sometimes, yeah, it's your stimulus value is different than somebody else's. And even just disclosing the same thing can have a different impact. And yeah, I've talked about that with, I can't remember, it was one of the disability researchers who was also talking about being careful about, so with invisible disabilities, do we disclose them because that can actually really help other students, but then can it actually get weaponized against you for whatever reason, versus masking through things that you can mask. And again, I think it's like a personal preference, and it probably changes as you get more, like once you're tenured and you're less worried about those kinds of things, or teaching tenure, you can probably have more leeway than before that point. And I think it's, some people just are more willing to be more some are more risk averse and some are more willing to take more of those risks. And I think you just have to figure out what you're personally comfortable with in that realm.
Yeah, I think that's super important to recognize that depending on the context of where you are and the body you inhabit and what the norms are and what you have to consider for advancing in your career or what stage you are at it. And I appreciate you mentioning tenure, because thinking about that, I'm like, yeah, I think I've been much more disclosing of identities post tenure because I have that privilege, right? I don't have to worry so much about that. So while it's wonderful when people can be fully authentic, we're not trying to criticize anyone who's not sharing absolutely everything, right? That's a very personal and privileged kind of decision to be able to make. The other thing you mentioned that I wanted to follow up on was self-disclosure, and less of a personal identities way, but just the sort of experiences within academia, and especially those frustrations that students may not be aware of when they think about psychology at first, or you were talking about research methods class, right? And so I think it's wonderful that you're also modeling, like talking through some of those, oh, that didn't work out, or that was a challenge. And that's something I think I try to do too in my mentoring, is to make sure students are not just seeing the highlights on my CV, right? They're also hearing about all the rejections and all the times I messed up. And we learn through our mistakes. And that's an inherent part of science. And arguably the funnest part of science is when you feel super stupid because something totally didn't work the way you were thinking, but then you learn something from it. And to try to model and teach that it's not something to be hidden and be ashamed
Yeah.
of and try to pretend like it didn't happen.
I was just going to say, I also really appreciate your comments on research from a student perspective, because I think that was a really hard awakening as an undergrad, was realizing, oh my gosh, research is so complicated. And then more so when I was working on my master's thesis, and I was like, just like all these little problems would come up. But especially now in hindsight, looking back and being like, oh my gosh, there's so many things I did that I could have done in a better way and stuff. But that growth process, and knowing that your mentor is willing to go through that growth process with you, makes the whole process of having mistakes and learning that there's better ways to do things much easier and far less stressful. So I do really appreciate that from the student standpoint. But yeah, piggybacking off of that last question, who or what really influenced this mentoring style that you've developed?
I think some of it's definitely just my personal experiences. I think like my first experience as an undergrad with someone who was first a teacher and then became a mentor, right? He's the one that, so it was my Psych 1 professor, and this was like a class of 500 and something, and it was like a few exams, and I took his technique of like, he literally like would email you if you were in the top. I don't know what his percentile was that he emailed, but he like actually is the one that approached me and was like, you're doing so well in my class. I think that you really have a knack for this. I want you to work in my lab. And it was like something that I like didn't even know was something that existed and wasn't really considered. I was like honestly the pre-med route for a while, and then it was like, oh, actually I really think I like psych even more, and I was going to do pre-med for the psychiatry route of that, and I was like, but I didn't think I would get as much training in therapy as I would going the PhD route, and so that was another factor towards going that route. But it was in social psych, and I was actually like considering social psych for the longest time. And then once I was teaching in Paris, right, and then that I was actually like seeing, it was in a really underserviced area, underprivileged kids, and seeing the impact of just all these other socioeconomic factors that you can't really help as a teacher, that really got me wanting to get more training in. And then there's also just a lack of child therapy. There's not enough of out there. And so that was also another impetus to get training in that as well, not just on the adult side. And so I still do a mix of the two. But I think that experience also, I think, influenced my mentoring style just by virtue of it's another one-on-one relationship. I've also done clinical supervision, and that's mentoring specifically for like becoming a clinician, but I think it also informs my mentoring style with undergrads as well. But definitely my undergrad, like Dan Gilbert, my undergrad advisor, is like a big part, is just because that was like my first experience with that. And I did a thesis with him. And then he also had me take I think in my senior year, I took a grad level class with his grad students, and it was about his book, Stumbling on Happiness. So I got to see a little bit of his style with grad students as well as with undergrad. I mean, he basically treated me like a grad student in a lot of ways, though, which I appreciated as well.
It's funny because I see a lot of parallels between you and I and how we got started being mentored, because I had a similar experience where I was taking a course and I was doing really well in it. And I had just casually mentioned to a different professor that I was interested in the work that my future mentor was doing. And he heard about that. And because of that and my grades, he was like, he just sought me out in the halls one day in between classes and was like, you're in my lab. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, I don't really know what that means, but all right. And yeah, just totally took me under his wing and provided a lot of guidance there. And then a parallel I wish I could have is your experience abroad. That sounds so meaningful and fulfilling. When I saw that line in your bio, I was like, oh my gosh, that's really impressive.
Hands down, still one of the best years of my life, I would say, to this day. Yeah, especially the year in France, because I'm a Francophile, and that culture it brings out, like, work-life balance is something you have to work really extra hard to achieve, I feel, here, whereas in France it's built into the culture, and so it's you have to work hard to not have work life balance over there. Like I had an hour and a half for lunch every day that I was working. When you're teaching, I was only working, I think it was still only 3 or 4 days a week, I can't remember now. I want to say 3 because I think Wednesdays in elementary schools were off. Granted, I was teaching English, and so it's not the primary. So, but students there would go to work. Yeah, they would go to school 4 days a week, and most people are working 4 days a week. There's a lot of paid vacations, so I got to travel all over the place on those paid vacations. So that's the other reason I feel like I just like absolutely loved it, because it was just, and it's just so easy to try in Europe. Like the trains are just so good that everything is. I even went all the way to Madrid, I think, and it was Madrid or Barcelona. I think maybe Barcelona, but it was whatever. It was like ridiculously easy, even that by train compared to here. The train system is pretty. On the Northeast, it's okay. And here, I think in Ann Arbor, I can go to Chicago. That's like the only place I can take the train and it'd be like reasonable. It's 4.5 hours. There's 1 or 2 a day if you're lucky. Whereas I'm from New York, so I'm very much like, I didn't realize just how spoiled I was growing up in New York until I left New York. I thought everywhere had subways that worked all the time and like all these other ridiculous assumptions that I made. But yeah, you don't know until you leave, and that's another reason I highly recommend. Yeah, and like experiencing different like education systems. Like I studied abroad in France, so I also was a student. That I think also helped a little bit before teaching English, just because you're supposed to not use any French, but they're like 8 to 11-year-olds and they're still struggling to learn French. It was like not a very realistic goal to only speak English to them. I was very grateful that my friend, even though they would make fun of your accent, it made my accent go away really quickly.
Oh, I bet.
I got very good because yeah, they'll find things to make fun of just because they're they're like young enough. But yeah, but they were at least fascinated with, I think it was easy to teach English because they're fascinated with American culture, and so they actually want to learn it. Whereas I feel like, yeah, I didn't have to sell that part as much, but it's just being the substitute teacher and being young and like wanting to be the fun one and then realizing you need to really actually be a little bit more strict in the beginning and then pull back versus they will try to walk all over you, but you learn quick.
And then do you think those experiences you had, especially with the culture over there, have really shaped how you mentor people as well? Like, do you really strive for good, solid work-life balance, or
I
hard to achieve
try. I
that?
feel like it is something I also like. It made me realize again the social psych aspect of the environment and how much the environment can actually influence things. Because even I would talk about Paris being so laid back, and like people in France would still laugh at me because Paris is like the most high strung of the rest of France. But to me, it was still so laid back coming from New York City where like everything is ridiculous. But it's all relative. I feel like if I had gone somewhere that was like, if like my friend that was in Italy, like it was fun to visit, but it would have driven me crazy not being able to rely on the train working and all these things that I was like, oh, it's great that I'm on vacation here, but working here would be super stressful. But at least I have all these things in Paris. It was a very good match. But I think so some of it, you really do have to like work extra hard when you don't have the culture. But I do try to, that's something I've learned because I really pride myself on being accessible to my students and my mentees especially. But then I've also had to like learn over time to set healthy boundaries, and it's okay, you can't be expecting me to give you feedback within 24 hours on this long manuscript. I need more time so that I can actually give you useful feedback. I'm not necessarily expecting responses over the weekends, things like that, where it's like, and then you're also like modeling good boundaries and self-care as well. But it can be hard sometimes, I feel like, 'cause it definitely sometimes conflicts with that value of I really want to be there and I want to be as helpful as possible. And I understand why sometimes things might take longer than expected and you can't get me something with several weeks notice. And I'm flexible with that when needed, but I definitely have learned to be really transparent about, hey, look, I need at least this X amount of time to get feedback for something like this. If it's like an abstract or something, fine. But if you're sending me this 20-page document, you can't expect me to get back to you within 24 hours.
So much of that resonated with me. And I don't know if I knew, Dina, that you were a New Yorker. I also grew up in New York City.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, I was just giggling to myself when you were talking about the assumption that wherever you are, like that's normal. And so every place will be like that. So I similarly like just assume public transit would be fantastic everywhere. And I actually didn't
I
until I
complained
was
about Boston so much when I first went there, and I was like, why does the T, first of all, why do you have to go like this to go this way? Like it was like very inefficiently done because it's only 4 lines or something. But then it also like, yeah, by midnight everything was done and shut down, and I was just like, but why? Then people end up driving when they're drinking and they're not, like it was just like to me it like made no sense, and I was like to not have a subway that worked.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I didn't even think of it as good because sometimes it would have delays or things would
No, I know. We
change.
always would rat on it and make fun of it. And
And
like,
then you
yes, it did
leave and
have
you're like,
delays
oh, it's the
sometimes, but
best.
like, at least it was there and it was working.
So yeah, I didn't end up learning to drive until I was forced to for grad school.
Me
And
too. It took me so long. Oh my God. And I still hate driving, honestly. I still make sure that I get to walk to campus instead of driving to campus because it's stressful and parking is a pain in the neck and it's extra expensive. And I like having the forced exercise.
oh, we are like the same exact person. So, I mean, Pocatello, Idaho, traffic and parking are not as big of an issue, but walking
Well,
to
Anna
work
was
was
not
my
usually too bad, but definitely like around class times and things like that, it can take you forever and you're much better off walking.
yeah, and it's lovely. It's a little bit of a stress relief. You get some steps in. Being able to walk to work was my number one thing when I was looking for housing. So it was lovely to learn that about you and having that commonality. Um, so you make studying abroad sound so fabulous. And especially it sounds like studying abroad in France, if you have that opportunity. And if you're a listener, consider it, look into it. You will have a lot more work-life balance. But I think also it's a great reminder that the way we do things, because that's the way things have always been done, or that's the way people around us do things, is not the only way that works, right? It works perfectly fine for other people in other places with other systems. And so picking and choosing the best bits when we travel is, I think, one of the best parts of traveling is figuring out like, oh, this thing I never questioned maybe is unnecessary and I can change that, or appreciating the things that I took for granted.
Oh, and like cafe culture there, you could sit in a cafe forever and a bistro forever. That does not happen in New York. They're like looking at you to get the bill, like the minute you stop eating anything at all. Like, so yeah, which I mean, sometimes again, that takes getting used to because sometimes you're just like, I really want to just actually please come take this check. I want to leave. I don't want this to be a 3-hour affair this time around, but I think it was very good to be forced to slow down like that. There was no, you can't get coffee to go. There's certain things that were just like, no, sit and enjoy your coffee. Like, yeah, why do I have to do 4 things at once? Why not actually enjoy it? There was also Sunday, a lot of things would be closed and that would drive me nuts. And then I was just like, you know what? Then you're not doing errands on Sundays because the grocery's closed anyway. So you get to enjoy your Sunday. Like, of course, I did have extra time off there, so it made it easier. I think if I was in the US, that was your only time to do your errands. It would be pretty stressful if you don't have that. I mean, I lived in London as well, but I didn't love it in the same way that I loved Paris. I think because the French culture is a little bit more different. I think they both emphasize work-life balance more so than the US. It's not hard to beat the US when it comes to work-life balance. We're pretty workaholic culture, but the French definitely, it's built in a lot of ways. Like you're not supposed to also like nowadays like email, there's rules against having to like email and use your phone past work hours and things like that so that you actually can keep that balance. And there's like rules
Wow.
to keep that, which I think really helps because then you're not the one that has to be the assertive one that's always going against the grain because there's so much pressure here to be available all the time. I find myself even on vacation sometimes being like, why do I feel like I need to even be checking this? That feeling of you're missing something, you're going to be missing something important. Maybe you should just check. It's like, nope, it shouldn't matter. Just put an away message on and peace out. But it's very hard when that's not what the expectation is often.
Yeah, I can't even imagine how that would work here, like trying to institute a rule, like even just on one campus or one department or something. You're not allowed to email during these hours. I don't think that would fly, but it is like it sounds like it works, right? So it's a cultural
I mean,
thing.
I'm sure there's exceptions for certain things or whatever, but and it's probably people like just set the email and then they just schedule it to be sent at a different hour, and then that's like,
Right.
but still, at least it still makes it easier to just okay, I'm not gonna be missing anything if I'm not checking my phone. But yeah, I don't see that working here. Like, there's a lot of things, and that's like a debate I have with students often because we talk like I teach a science of happiness class and we talk a lot about the role of culture in happiness, and then a lot of the things that are really good, we're like, I think we wouldn't be able to see these things emphasized in US culture. Like, we're a little too individualistic.
And we internalize that culture. So even when you're trying to fight it, I hear you on vacations, I'm still like, I need to check my email just to make sure enough, even if I have an away message on. What if something happened? And also, if I don't check it and I come back from vacations, there are going to just be like hundreds of emails. So it's a tricky balance, but also trying to fight not just the system, but also like my own guilt about it or worry that, oh, people are going to think I'm lazy if I'm not constantly, or those sorts of things. So you touched on this a tiny bit when you were talking about what influenced your mentoring style. But I wanted to ask about how DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, has shown up or not in your mentoring experiences, whether that's as a mentor and or someone being mentored.
As a mentor, I've actually mentored primarily historically underrepresented students like me, mostly I think because they actually end up coming up to me for whatever reason more so than others. And so I would say there's that aspect of it. Then there's also just the same ways that DEI influences inclusive teaching and what I do in the classroom. It's also influenced my mentoring one-on-one, just inclusive teaching practices applied to mentoring specifically. I've learned to start having a mentoring agreement or survey in the beginning. What kinds of mentoring has worked for you in the past? I learned this for, especially because in clinical psych, we do that for clinical supervision. What kind of supervisor? Do you want a lot of directive feedback? Do you want me to hold back? How much guidance do you want? Because especially I was supervising students that were literally grad students just starting out. It's their first time ever doing any therapy, any evidence-based therapy whatsoever. And I think there's a lot of differences in terms of just individual differences in preferences for how much hand-holding they might want. Because I could also do to the point of co-therapy and actually doing a session with them. So I think like I learned from that. I now actually do that in my mentoring, even though I feel like the amount of guidance is like not quite as different, right? It's more, okay, do you want like weekly meetings? Do you want monthly? Versus with therapy, I had to learn it's, okay, do you really want me to be doing this session with you? Do you want me to like be leading it and you jumping in, versus do you want me to sit back and let you actually lead it and only jump in as absolutely needed? But I feel like it still helps, like that we know that transparency is really useful. And so in the mentoring relationship, it's being also clear about what your expectations are about your availability, right? That's where I was like, okay, don't necessarily expect me to be writing back within 24 hours, giving you feedback on these things. As much as I would love to give you that quick turnaround, that's just not going to happen. It's really hard to do, right? That kind of thing. And just being upfront about it from the beginning. And I also talk about whether they want to meet in person or Zoom. Ever since the pandemic, that's just like something I've continued to offer because students just find it a lot easier sometimes versus having to like go to your office. But my therapy experience has definitely influenced just even how I set up my office, making sure tissues are accessible, making sure the seats are in an equitable way, and don't force complete awkward eye contact the entire time. Just things that you like learn for setting up your therapy office also kind of apply to setting up your office for mentoring. Again, things like facilitating growth mindset in the classroom, I also try to do, and we know that's something that helps everyone. And so that goes back to the whole being vulnerable, being able to own up to mistakes, and like when things don't work out, yeah, showing the, hey, the joy and I get to actually learn from this experience, learn from the mistakes. And as long as I learn from them, then there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. That's also part of what you were saying, Mona, it's part of science. That's part of the process. And just the more you can model that. And I think emphasizing belonging the same way that I do in the classroom, but you do that more because that's something that I know, we know from research, but I also know from personal experience that helped me so much. Like I went to Harvard convinced I was the admissions mistake, and then the welcome speech that first day, literally it was like they're reading your mind. Like, you might think that you're the admissions mistake, but we really, we took a lot of time to decide on these and you really belong here. And it was like very powerful to hear that. And then again, like Dan Gilbert, like, you belong in psychology, like you should be working in my lab. You got like the third highest score in the class, so you need to be doing this thing. And I was like, I would have never known that was where I stood. I knew I did well, but I didn't know that there were even that few. And he's like, no, there's very few A's in this class. I'm like, okay, all right. But that message of you belong, I think, is super powerful. And so just not underestimating the importance of that, especially when they're struggling. Because that's when you usually like question the belonging the most. And that's, I think, back to, nope, this is part of science and it's not a reflection on you. And it's just part of the process.
Yeah, that's so important. And thinking about all you've talked about in terms of belongingness, but also being vulnerable, modeling authenticity, it makes sense to me then that students are approaching you because you've probably developed a reputation for being accessible, for being really, thinking about them and their well-being and encouraging growth mindset and building that sense of belonging. And I love that we heard both from the professors reaching out and being like, okay, you're going to work in my lab, as well as students being empowered to go up to someone and say, hey, I want to work with you. Like, both sides of those are great ways to make it work. And as you were talking, I was like, you know what? I probably need to tell my students who do well that they're doing well a little more frequently, right? Or being really more encouraging, or just when I bump into them in the hallway or something, saying something about how well they're doing, because sometimes, especially with teaching, we get focused on providing feedback and we might not be giving as much of the belongingness and positive messaging that we should. So thank you for that.
So, Dina, I feel like you touched on a lot of practical things that people can do regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And those are all really good. So I'm wondering, what are some other like little tips or pieces of advice that you would like to give to mentors?
That's a good question. I think don't be afraid to change your mentoring approach either over time or across students, depending on the different needs of your students. Because that's, I think, I don't know if it's also because I'm still relatively on the young side. I feel like I'm very open to constantly that trial and error of figuring out what your style really is. For example, because I care so much about being really collaborative and not being authoritarian, initially I would go by my first name. And then I quickly learned that's not a good idea, only because of how you get treated as a woman, especially. It's already hard to get people to call you doctor, even though I don't really personally love having to insist on being called doctor. I don't do that in the therapy realm as much, but I've learned to do that in the classroom just because I feel like I'm already young and like accessible and approachable, but then sometimes like without that extra layer, you can get put into being treated like a friend more than like a professor by your students, or disrespected in other ways. And so I think it doesn't always prevent that, but it helps a little bit. But that's something that I've had to again learn through time, and like it wasn't until I tried going the laid back Dina route that I then saw how that was being perceived, that I was like, oh wait a minute, maybe I do need to actually go back to this title that I did earn, and like, why am I questioning using it? Yeah, I think that there is, especially because the research on this is relatively new, and also it's never going to be a one size fits all approach. And so being open to changing, because even something that works really well for you with many students might not work with every student. So you have to be really open to adapting your approach. Just like you have to with teaching. Like, one of the things I love about teaching, but also can sometimes be overwhelming, is that it's always, in order to be good, you're like, especially psychology, because psychology is so young that it's like always changing. So you're like always updating your slides and always updating your activities and always updating like everything. Now with like ChatGPT, everybody was like freaking out about AI and how that's going to change education. And I'm like, there's always something. We're always going to be adapting to something. So yeah, learning to be a lifelong learner, and embracing that is also really important. And that's something that I also try to model for students and mentees as well, because I feel like that's probably the most useful skill there is no matter what you're doing in life, you're going to be having to learn something new. And that's why growth mindset's so important, because you're going to suck at something in the beginning, and you have to be able to tolerate that discomfort of not being good right away. And that's something I've had to learn the hard way as well, because I definitely used to shy away from challenge just out of fear of not being perfect on things. And it took teachers that would like that started noticing that and pushing the opposite and being like, nope, you need to be challenging yourself more. Yeah, if I see that, I also tend to do that as well with students. But
Thank you. Those are all such great tips. And I really appreciate this theme that's coming through of always changing and being flexible and adapting. And super appreciate you sharing your experiences with letting students use your first name. And because I can see that is very much in line with all the things you've been talking about, but it can also go a little too far. So there are times where it's towards this end of being very student centered that I want to do, but doesn't mean you have to go 100% that way, right? So finding that place that is effective, but also not going to be detrimental to you too. And then adjusting that, because that will change over time based on where you are or career wise or all sorts of things. So that's really great too, that just because something might on paper be consistent with your values doesn't mean it'll always work out when you're trying it, and you might need to make adjustments. So as we get to the end of this, and this has been such a lovely conversation, aside from going to Europe and enjoying being a Francophile, how do you take care of yourself? What are your favorite forms of self-care?
So a big one does still involve travel. I try to visit New York City regularly because I miss it really dearly. I have family there, so I'm also like staying with family when I go. I usually try to catch at least one Broadway show while I'm there, sometimes more than one, depending on when I go and what the deals are at TKTS, etc. But theater is definitely something, I mean, I grew up with it. Back when it was like you could get good seats for $40 regularly, we would go once a month as a family to a show. So yeah, I obviously don't go with that frequency anymore, but I definitely go when I can, and I think that it's my therapy in a lot of ways, because you can like lose yourself in the storytelling. I really like musicals, and so there's also the dopamine hit from the music, and just that the collective experience of the alchemy between the audience and the cast. And I've definitely experienced that through the like Broadway closing, and then since the pandemic and reopening, like I got to see Waitress, that was like one of the first performance that reopened from the pandemic, and like the amount of energy in that room. Like my husband begrudgingly went, and then he was like, oh my God, this was so amazing. Because everyone was just so grateful that live theater was back. We were all masked, but everyone was like up and clapping for everything. They got like 20 standing ovations that show. But it's a very energizing, unique experience. We have season tickets to Broadway in Detroit to see certain shows, because you can do that really cheaply over here, but you don't get everything. And I really like to see things like from the ground up. Like I saw New York, that I don't think is going to tour, and got to see like the first like if you get preview tickets, they're usually cheaper than show, because it's before there's any publicity for it. So you also have to know which shows to look out for, but you can get really cheap tickets. Like I got maybe $79, and it was like the first row. So relatively speaking, for first row of the orchestra in the center, it's pretty good. But obviously you can't do that on a day-to-day. I feel like on a day-to-day, I take my therapy pup for a walk. I'm usually walking pretty quickly at a New Yorker pace. So it's good exercise, but it's also good mindfulness practice, because he's literally stopping and smelling the flowers half the time. And so just encouraging you to really take all the little things in and be mindful while you're doing it. So those 2 self-care things.
Both sound lovely, and thank you for that bonus on how to get affordable tickets.
And TKTS is also pretty great. And most people don't know that once you get one ticket there, you can skip the line the next time around for the next like 48 hours or so. So you can get tickets really quickly. Yeah, and when I stayed there for a week, like around Thanksgiving, I got to see a lot of. Yeah, there's also like Wednesdays are the best way to see a show. Like I went to the box office for POTUS and got it was like $30 tickets, and it was like row
Wow.
F of the orchestra, and it was just like 5 minutes before curtain. So you have to be okay with, okay, it might not work out and I'll run to something else, or I will wait for the next show. But yeah, that was on a Wednesday, because Wednesday they have two shows. So yeah, the matinee is usually the cheapest. But I got that with all the original Broadway cast, and it was phenomenal to see. So I was glad. Yeah, it definitely is hard to not miss living there, I think. But I definitely try to make the most of having family there and going there as much as I can.
That sounds like amazing self-care. And I wish you all the shows and everything lining up for the next time you go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking with us today. This was so great.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And for listeners, thank you for tuning in and stay tuned for more episodes in this series.